Thanks for sticking around. It's been a long day. So I'm going to be talking about how Bitcoin became a premier means of payments in Africa. I'll tell you a little bit. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to be speaking from my experience, being an African, being an early Bitcoin adopter, and actually seeing how the whole scene developed. So you're going to be getting a little bit of a history lesson, more or less, about how Bitcoin actually became, the really big force in Africa that it is today. So my name is Tim Akinbo, and I do a number of things. I'm a software developer. I also develop applications in Bitcoin. I have contributed to Bitcoin Core, so I remember when I made my first contribution, I asked this question on Twitter: does that make me a Bitcoin Core contributor? And Peter actually replied and said, yes, that makes you a Bitcoin Core contributor. So yeah, I have that badge. In addition, I'm also one of the co-founders of an institute based in Africa called Qala. And our mission is actually very simple. We are raising the next generation of Bitcoin and Lightning Network developers in Africa. So a lot of the things that I'll be talking about, will give you some insight into how Bitcoin actually developed in Africa. I'd also give you some insights into the current problems with Bitcoin adoption and Bitcoin usage in Africa, and some of the solutions that I think will become very instrumental in actually making Bitcoin even better for Africans. So Plato actually said, he wrote actually, that our need will be the real creator. And it's from this statement that, we have this saying that necessity is the mother of invention. And nothing could be farther from the truth where Bitcoin in Africa is concerned. For a lot of people, Bitcoin is very interesting, right? It's cool. For a lot of people in Africa, Bitcoin is their savior. It's a solution to a big problem. And you would learn how this came to be. You'll learn about the problems, and you'll learn about how Bitcoin became a solution to these problems. So I said, I'm an early Bitcoin adopter. Actually, I learned about Bitcoin in 2011, I think. I came across this article, I think it was Slashdot, I think, but one of these tech blogs, and it was talking about Bitcoin and what Bitcoin actually is. Now, why was I kind of drawn to Bitcoin, especially in the early days? Well, it's because prior to this time, I'd had a major problem, right? Now, I'm originally from Nigeria, so yes. And forgive me, I'm not the Nigerian prince. Don't worry, I'm not going to be sending you any emails. But I had a major problem, right? So even the Nigerian prince has a problem, which is how is he going to get paid, right? And for a very long time, before we had the likes of Visa and MasterCard, it was nearly impossible for you to send money or receive money internationally. It was next to impossible. Now, I happen to have discovered the internet quite early. I think my first time I was actually online was sometime maybe in 99, early 2000s. And I kind of witnessed e-commerce become a thing. And, it was easy for a lot of people in the West to, sign up online and buy things online and have them delivered to their homes, or buy digital items or digital products and download them, music tracks. But this was something that I didn't have access to. And, we also started to see a lot of online working, remote working also occur around that time where you have people who could provide certain services online and they'll get paid. PayPal was one of those very early platforms where we were pretty much excluded from participating in. Before Bitcoin, there was this platform called eGold. Some of you might have heard about eGold. It was this digital platform where you could send and receive money, which was mostly denominated in gold and some other precious metals. And one of the really interesting things about eGold was that it didn't really have a lot of restrictions on who was allowed to sign up or use it. I guess maybe the reason was because it was the asset that was being exchanged really was just gold, right? And so maybe it was easier then to have anyone actually own little bits of gold. And that was how I was, able to get some work done. I'll get paid in eGold, and we had a network where it was easy for you to exchange your eGold for actual currency, or if you actually wanted to make a payment, you could exchange your local fiat currency for eGold, and then make the payment online. But if any of you knows the history of eGold, eGold actually came out under attack, and it got shut down by the Fed. And a lot of people overnight just kind of lost access to a financial network that they could use to send and receive money. Now, shortly after then, that was when I heard about Bitcoin. And why did I get interested in Bitcoin? Well, it had this property. The claim was that Bitcoin was decentralized, that Bitcoin couldn't be shut down by any government, that Bitcoin was peer-to-peer. And, given my technical background, I looked at the whole thing and I was like, wait, no, I can't imagine how you have a currency that can work like that. So in my bid to actually kind of disprove Bitcoin and its claims, I decided to sign up and actually give this technology a run. Try it out, let me see how it works. Let me try and identify where the scam is and where, the proponents of Bitcoin were lying, right? And so I actually downloaded the software. I synced up to the tip of the chain at that time. And fortunately, we still had Bitcoin faucets. So I was able to, put one of these randomly or pseudo-randomly generated series of letters and numbers that they call the Bitcoin address into one of those faucets and make a request. And seconds later, I had Bitcoin. Okay, this sounded kind of interesting, looked interesting. It's like, okay, maybe there's some magic going on in the background and, maybe the software is communicating with the faucet and, somehow I got the Bitcoin. So I decided, okay, I'm going to have a friend of mine set up a wallet and I'm going to do a transaction, try and send money to them. They set up a wallet, I did a transaction, boom, Bitcoin was in their wallet. And then something that really struck me was I now looked at the whole process that I went through to get signed up to use a wallet. First and foremost, I didn't have to sign up, right? All I had to do was just download the software like I would download a BitTorrent client, for example, and sync up to the chain, and I could receive money. Well, that was kind of interesting. And so that piqued my interest. So I actually I want to know how this thing works. Because if this thing really works as I am experiencing, as I am reading about it, and this technology survives the next couple of years, I think we have something on our hands here that could change the world. Well, 13 years later, we're here, or would I say 12 years later, we're here, and Bitcoin is changing the world. It wasn't, at that time, I really was only interested in how Bitcoin could actually facilitate payments. I have money, I want to pay for something, or I have something, and someone wants to pay me for that thing, and that there was this technology that did not discriminate on who I was, where I came from, the color of my skin, what religious affiliation I had. I knew that this technology would change the world, only if it survives. In the early days with Bitcoin adoption in Africa, I have to say that there are a number of people that I really want to have make a shout out to, who have actually been very instrumental in spreading the word about Bitcoin in the African continent. Some of those people include folks like Alakanani Itirileng. Some of you may have known about her. We call her Bitcoin Lady. Philip Agiasari, whom should have been here today, but for a number of reasons he was unable to make it. And Cherno Said from Sierra Leone. He was one of the contributors to Let's Talk Bitcoin. Some of you may know about Let's Bitcoin, the real OGs, Adam B. Levine, Andreas, and Stephanie Murphy. Those were really, really fun times. So this was 2011. All this happened between 2011 and 2017. How did Bitcoin actually start trading? So one of the very big problems that Bitcoin has is how you get new people onboarded, right? We have folks like Anita Posh here, who has done a very tremendous amount of work in helping to educate people in Africa about Bitcoin, and she has a ton of stories really to tell about the process she has gone through in not only educating people but also onboarding them, getting them their first Bitcoin. And getting Bitcoin then was a bit of a challenge, right? So besides just maybe farming Bitcoin faucets to get little bits of Satoshis here and there, if you really wanted to buy Bitcoin, like to do a significant transaction, couple of tens of dollars, it was kind of difficult to come by. Back then, I remember when I bought my first Bitcoin, I found a way to actually sign up for a PayPal account using a US address. And we had a lot of very, very enterprising entrepreneurs who found ways to allow people who had Naira and who wanted to exchange it for PayPal US dollars to be able to do so. And so, of course, at an incredibly, high premium, we would acquire some PayPal US dollars. And I remember some platforms like Bitcoin OTC, where they had this IRC channel where you could actually do P2P transactions with people and you could build a reputation. And I remember getting my very first Bitcoin on that platform. But, that was just the first one, and it was very expensive. And so I really didn't think about how that would be scalable going forward, especially if I was going to get people onboarded into the technology. And then I had a very brilliant idea. Why should I, what if, rather than I going through this really complicated process of, using PayPal, and, then we started having lots of problems with scams, where people will say they've sent PayPal, or they would actually send it, and then you have chargebacks. And so, PayPal as a means to acquire Bitcoin was becoming less and less popular. The idea struck me that, maybe I could actually offer to provide some kind of service. And I signed up on Local Bitcoins. So Local Bitcoins was very instrumental in the early days. As at the time when I signed up, there was zero liquidity for the Naira to Bitcoin on the platform. And I decided, okay, well, if I am going to help bootstrap Bitcoin on the continent, or even in my country, well, I'll have to actually create offers. So I had a number of offers out there. And I remember my very first transaction. It came from a fellow Nigerian who was in South Africa at that time. who wanted to send some money to his family in Nigeria. I was in Nigeria, and he pinged me up when he saw my ad on local Bitcoins, and he then, went through the process of, okay, I want you to help me send this amount of money to my family in Nigeria, and I will pay you Bitcoin. Of course, I had set my rates, how much I was willing to exchange the Naira for Bitcoin, and we did the first transaction. And then we did another transaction, and yet another transaction. And then he moved, from South Africa, and he was now in Australia, and he still continued. As a result of, those transactions, we built a rapport, and we actually had a relationship. And little by little, the transactions started to come, 1, 2, and then other people started to realize, oh, maybe there is actually an opportunity here, and they started to create offers of their own, and I was no longer the only person who was offering liquidity on local Bitcoins for people to build, to be able to transact with Bitcoin. Now this, was a thing that actually started to grow little by little, and it actually started becoming even more prominent as a means for people to actually provide certain services or payments, and would create a market where people could acquire Bitcoin with Naira, or they could send, they could sell Bitcoin to get Naira, right? And this was actually the very, very early stages. One of the things that has always been the key drivers for the adoption of Bitcoin in Africa really has just been in solving very, very, very important problems. Remember how I told you about the difficulties I had with, just being able to receive money and send money internationally? Well, I wasn't the only one who had that problem. And it turns out Bitcoin was actually the best solution we had at that time for a number of reasons. One, it was possible for you to send actually even small amounts of money using Bitcoin. And not only that, it turns out that it was an even freer market. So there was some form of price discovery that happened, and it turns out that people actually got better rates because they didn't have an intermediary through maybe something like a central bank that would set rates for the exchange of something like the US dollar to Naira. And so it grew, leaps and bounds as a result of that. Some of the early stories I have with how Bitcoin actually became kind of like a lifesaver really has to do with just even things as simple as just moving money across borders. It was in 2014, thereabouts. My team, we had a retreat, and we went to a neighboring country in West Africa called Ghana. And we were going to lodge at this Airbnb, or this apartment, who turns out that the owner of the apartment was a Ghanaian woman who lived in the UK. And, okay, we had this problem where how was I going to pay her in order to stay in her apartment? We liked the apartment, and obviously she would not be able to accept Naira. I couldn't send Naira digitally to her in the UK. But then I had this brilliant idea that, oh, hold on, I've been doing transactions involving Bitcoin and the Naira on local Bitcoins. Is there a way I could actually use the same platform to send pounds to her account? And yes, actually there was. And so it was a no-brainer, really, for me, that it was easy for me to just convert Naira into Bitcoin and then sell those Bitcoins for pounds. And the whole process of the whole transaction probably took maybe less than 30 minutes. And it could have taken shorter, but because you're dealing with people, sometimes, there are delays in the communication and, getting them to confirm payments and then release the Bitcoin so you can, use it for the next step. The whole process maybe took about 30 minutes or 45 minutes. The interesting thing is, she wasn't even aware that I was using Bitcoin as the intermediary to facilitate that payment All she knew was, oh, he wants to rent my apartment. Okay, he said, we're going to transfer this amount of pounds to your account. You get the deposit. And, when the transaction went through, I asked her, have you received it? And she confirmed payment. And then I released Bitcoin to whomever it is the person was that was providing service to me. And that was when I really started to understand the real global nature of Bitcoin and how Bitcoin could really solve this problem of sending money across borders. And it was beyond just being able to send money across borders, but also just being able to send money, to anywhere in the world, even if that person doesn't accept Bitcoin. If the person is, I just want to see fiat in my bank account, it can be done. And this was something I kind of realized very early, and realized that Bitcoin really, really was going to create a huge opportunity for people who had this problem. And little by little, this industry actually kind of was born. Now, I'm going to tell you something that happened about 2 years ago. So prior to this time, Bitcoin had been growing little by little. Other people were beginning to identify the potential that Bitcoin could be used for, receiving remittances into the country and also facilitate international payments. And Nigerians are very enterprising people. They run businesses. I would say maybe 1 out of every 2 Nigerians is an entrepreneur, just because, it's something that they do out of necessity. Just to be able to survive daily, you're either running some kind of side hustle or you're running some kind of business. Even if you have a 9-to-5 job, there's something else that you're doing by the side. It might be that maybe you're selling clothes to your coworkers, or you're running some kind of side consultancy by the side. We call them side gigs. And as a result, it didn't take too long for people to realize, maybe I could actually set up a business providing a means for people who want to send money to their family back at home to be able to do so. Conveniently, probably even get better rates, because then they will not be subjected to the very, very predatory rates that, lots of money transfer organizations will charge in terms of fees, in terms of the exchange rate. And this industry started to grow little by little. Now, this wasn't actually just going to happen without, the authorities taking note. I'll give you some stats. So one of the very, very big industries, that creates foreign exchange for Nigeria is remittances. Every year, Nigerians who are in the diaspora will send money back home, and it contributes to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. In 2019, $19.2 billion were sent from outside Nigeria as remittances to Nigeria. The following year, in 2020, that number had dropped to $5.5 billion. So from $19 billion to 5.5. The year after that, 2021, this had dropped yet again from 5.5 billion to $1.96 billion. So in just 2 years, we can see that the amount of funds that were sent through the official channels, which were recorded as remittances, had dropped by almost 90%. Now, anyone who is smart, we try and figure out, okay, what's going on here? Now, obviously, a lot of people will say, wasn't 2019 the year when, we had the global pandemic? And, we know what happened, over the next 2 years. People were kind of subjected to, lockdowns, and we had a lot of people actually not being able to work and what have you. And yes, I do accept that, that might have contributed to that significant decline in remittances. But also, there is a big part that Bitcoin played in this. And it's very obvious, actually, to see what happened as a result. Now, if it were just an issue of, it's just a temporary thing and we know exactly why, then the next thing that the government will do would not have made any sense. On February 5th of 2021, the central bank, of Nigeria, which is the regulator for all the financial institutions in Nigeria, mandated that all banks and all financial institutions should not provide financial services to anyone, and by anyone I mean individuals, companies that had anything to do with cryptocurrencies. This, actually created a big problem. 2017 was a year when we had that first bull run for a lot of people in Nigeria. And a lot of crypto companies, Bitcoin companies that were providing one kind of service using blockchains or using cryptocurrencies, we had this huge boom in the industry. Lots of people were setting up platforms like exchanges, they were setting up brokerages and what have you, and all of a sudden, the central bank comes out and says, okay, you've had enough with your game now. Banks, you have to prevent these people from using the financial system. And a lot of people in the industry in Nigeria have coined February 5th, 2021 as the P2P day. And why do we call it P2P day? Because despite the fact that the apex bank of the country or the regulator of all the financial institutions in the country had kind of mandated that these financial institutions not provide services to all these companies and individuals, it didn't kill the entire industry. What happened was that people started trading peer-to-peer. So all transactions now started to occur on a peer-to-peer basis. Okay, so if the bank shuts down the account of a financial or a crypto company, well, how would they know what the purpose of a particular transfer between two individuals who were, trading something or, having some kind of financial transaction, what the purpose was for? And we started to see peer-to-peer as a means for transacting Bitcoin to become a really, really big industry. Now, as it stands till this very day, peer-to-peer is still the predominant way that people are able to buy and sell Bitcoin in Nigeria. And it's not just Nigeria alone, because we've seen that not only did the central bank in Nigeria come up with regulation, basically forcing these companies out and locking up the financial industry to these companies, the same thing also started to happen in quite a number of other African countries. The ones that were kind of, mild in their approach basically just said, cryptocurrencies are very speculative, they are not legal tender, and that anyone who is involved in cryptocurrencies was basically doing so at their own risk. And this created a lot of fear, especially for those who, were very interested in, I want to know how this thing works. It seems like a very interesting thing to get involved in. Because of that pronouncement by quite a number of central banks, it kind of shut them off from even making an attempt to dabble into it. But that would not kill the entire industry. What ended up happening was that for a lot of people who needed to provide some kind of service, and for example, I'll give you an instance. If you had the predominant way, I would say, maybe about 90% of the transactions that involves sending money abroad to make payments for certain kinds of things, they happen through Bitcoin these days. And why is that? So as the central bank actually had this big issue with, not having sufficient dollars, they started to restrict what kinds of industries or what kinds of products would have access to the dollars that they actually have. So this might be strange to some of you, but the way it works in quite a number of African countries, especially where you have countries that don't have huge foreign exchange reserves, is that when you have someone who wants to make an import, who wants to import something into the country, they have to first of all go to the central bank and say, I'm interested in importing this particular item into the country, and I would like to buy dollars from you in order to be able to make that payment. The reason why most companies would prefer to do that is because they would get preferential exchange rates. And so rather than go to the free market, which would actually kind of increase their costs, they would rather try to find ways to access that window that the central bank will provide. And because of this very limited amount of dollars, what ended up happening was that they started creating restrictions on which kinds of companies had access to what and what kinds of products or items they could actually get dollars for. And for a lot of people who were running legitimate businesses and who needed dollars in order to be able to import certain items that were on the blacklist, and blacklists, I use that term loosely here, was that they had to source their dollars. Either they go to the black market or they will go to transfer organizations who will help them facilitate the payment. And because dollars were becoming even more scarce, it now started becoming a lifeline that someone actually had the ability to make a payment for someone using Bitcoin. And this wasn't only when it came to maybe when you want to import things into the country, but it also came to people who wanted to export things. Rather than go to the central bank to sell whatever dollars you get as proceeds, you would sell them to someone else who would give you better exchange rates. And sometimes, you would have exporters who will directly receive cryptocurrency for their items and can then exchange those cryptocurrencies for, Naira. Now, these platforms, have evolved. There used to be a time when we would use local Bitcoins, but the platforms started getting restricted, and more people were getting excluded, sometimes mostly because of KYC and what have you. Now, I'd like to share something with you. On the continent of Africa, and I will speak specifically for Nigeria, when it comes to KYC, what do you need for KYC? Okay, you need a government-issued document, and sometimes you need some kind of proof of address. There are a lot of people in Nigeria who don't have either of this. So whether it is a government issue identification document, well, they've never really had to use any government services. And so they don't have access to a passport. They don't plan on traveling anywhere. They don't have a driving license. They rely on public transportation. Well, they can't afford to buy a car, so why would they need a driving license? And then when it comes to having a proof of address, well, they have to provide utilities themselves, right? So whether it's water, there's a well that is dug in their backyard. Whether it's electricity, they have an electricity generator that they bought that supplies power for them. And so, in fact, some of their houses are actually built in places that don't even have a street name. And so having access to the appropriate document in order to be able to pass whatever KYC requirements are required in order to be included on these platforms is just something that they don't have access to. But thankfully, Bitcoin actually, as a protocol, does not require any of this. And as a result, we started to see that a lot of the transactions now started happening off of some of these platforms that now started requiring KYC in order to be able to continue to transact on them. And one of the very interesting things that I have noticed in my working with some of these people are just how they developed trust networks. So, we had Leah earlier on who was talking about the Vexly platform and how it works. And I kept thinking about how a lot of the peer-to-peer transactions work right now. She talked about how it happens on some of these messaging platforms. And it's kind of interesting to see how it has evolved on the African continent. Now, I happen to have traveled to some African countries, spent some time there, also, participated in some of the Bitcoin communities, trading communities, and seen that there has been this kind of common path in the development of how those markets have evolved. And I find that there are actually certain things that the rest of the world could learn about how the necessity of having to be able to carry out transactions in very low trust environments has actually occurred. I'll tell you a story about how, one of the messaging platforms that I have participated in, how it works. A lot of times, we have two models when it comes to how these platforms are actually organized. Some of them are open, so anyone is actually allowed to join, and then you can attempt to make announcements about your offers or interest in buying Bitcoin. Some of them are closed. The closed ones are actually very interesting because they rely on social graphs of trust or a web of trust in order to operate. If someone is interested in joining one of those groups, usually it will be through knowledge of someone who is already in the group. And so they would act as their sponsor when they're joining the group. And everyone in the group will know, okay, this person was introduced to this group through this particular person. And a lot of times, there's always a very high standard that is required from every participant in that group when it comes to trust. And so a lot of times when transactions take place, they happen directly between individuals. There's actually no need for escrow at those particular points in time. Now you may ask, well, are there not situations where transactions go awry and there's a need for someone to arbitrate between the two partners or two parties that were involved in that transaction? Yes, they do occur. Now remember that this is a group, a very exclusive group, and every member who joins there because of the privilege that they've been given to join that group. And so it is actually seen as a breach of that trust, and not only of that, but also you might also be putting the person who introduced you into the group in trouble, right? Because, well, everyone knows you were the one who brought this person. You have to sort this issue out. And so a lot of times when it comes to things like dispute resolution, what generally will happen is that every partner or party to that particular transaction will present their case between usually a set of jurors who act as arbitrators in that particular trade. And then, they would observe the facts of the case, and then based on whatever, was determined through the facts that were presented, one person will be made to, basically make good on what the agreement was. And I would say that, 99% of the time, these issues have always been resolved. In fact, maybe I would say about 100% because I've never really observed the situation where a case, went on and was never treated. Sometimes it might take a long period of time. I've seen cases where something happened and, someone had to make good on the agreement, but it took a while because, they had to, first of all, acquire the income to be able to do so. But in every single case, they found a way to make it work. And, one of the things that I've found in this particular case that was very interesting really was in so many other things, it's very hard actually to build trust. But one of the good things with having systems like this is how by just allowing people to rely on their social connections, it builds a system of trust where I don't necessarily have to trust everyone in the group, but as long as we're all in that group, I know that I can trust them. Because if any issue actually comes up, there are people on ground who will stand by me to actually make good from my other counterparty in that transaction, on that particular transaction, on that particular case. And this is something I think that could really influence how platforms in the future are developed in order to cater for environments like this where there's actually very low trust. I'm going to finish with talking about where I see Bitcoin adoption on the continent go. So remember when I started with my introduction, I told you guys about the organization that I co-founded with 3 other members of my, colleagues of mine. We identified that on the continent there has been a very low participation of developers in building solutions on Bitcoin. Now, like I've mentioned to you, we have lots of very interesting problems that are not very common, especially to the West, and a lot of the solutions that are developed for Bitcoin happen to be kind of geared towards solving the problems in the West. And we have very specific problems that need solutions as well. And I think that those solutions are going to be solved by Africans who are actually the ones who experience these problems. And that's what led us to found Qala as an organization, to actually teach developers who actually have experience and skill in other areas how to build using the Bitcoin protocol, how to build solutions using Bitcoin as a technology. I'm glad to inform you that we have graduated our first cohort. Some of our fellows are actually working in several Bitcoin companies. Some of them actually have been able to get grants to work on some open source projects like BDK, which is one of the projects that one of our fellows actually is contributing to. His name is Vlad. And we are in our process of actually working through our second cohort. The future for Bitcoin in Africa is looking very, very bright. Despite a lot of the things that we talk about, where we talk about store value, we talk about inscriptions and ordinals, people are building real solutions on Bitcoin. And the really, really great thing about Bitcoin is the fact that it's permissionless. And that allows anyone to build whatever solution that they see in their minds to be able to do so. So thank you very much. I hope you've learned 1 or 2 things. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Can you tell us about the situation with the Naira, like CBDC in Nigeria?
Sure. So, in fact, one of the things that happened recently was there is a blockchain policy that was recently passed in Nigeria, specifically. It turns out that the blockchain policy was going to exclude anything crypto, and it was just about blockchain. So, blockchain, not cryptocurrency. And one of the perversions, really, when it comes to this technology that Bitcoin is built on, is a lot of central bankers and governments actually interested in using that technology or co-opting that technology to create their own versions of a cryptocurrency. And one of such efforts was the e-Naira, which was something that was introduced about 2 years ago as a means to, there's always going to be this argument that we want to, include people, we want to bank the unbanked. And the really interesting thing is, remember when I mentioned about we being in a very low trust environment, Nigerians were not very keen on adopting that technology. Now, despite what you hear on the media, you hear, oh no, the technology is growing, people are adopting it. But in reality, I don't know any single person, whether it's in my family or friends or colleagues or people who I exchange messages with that has, for some reason used the technology. And I think eventually what we might end up seeing is the technology might get forced on the population. So how is that likely going to happen? Well, first of all, maybe government workers or government employees are going to be forced to take their salaries in the e-Naira. That's something that could happen. And it's really scary to see what that could lead to, especially when you consider the fact that this could be something that could lead to, a lot of exclusion. We know all the kind of fears and the concerns we have about how CBDCs might get implemented. But I would say that for a lot of people, they're not really concerned about how that could really play out. And I'll tell you why. Remember how I mentioned that a lot of the transactions happen peer-to-peer? Well, a lot of that is going to happen, right? So despite the fact that we have the e-Naira, people will still be able to use Bitcoin. And I think it will only just be even further validation of the fact that Bitcoin really is a technology everyone should take seriously. So even those who aren't using Bitcoin right now because for the one reason or the other, they don't consider that it's something that they need. I think the more the government pushes the e-Naira, the more they realize that, okay, maybe I should take this seriously. And I think it's just going to lead to even more adoption of Bitcoin. Any other question? Sure.
Hi. In your experience, do Nigerians hold Bitcoin or do they hold Naira and convert it when you want to send it?
That's a good question. Well, I can say for the vast majority of Nigerians, I can talk about the Nigerians who use Bitcoin. And, every day I keep hearing stories about how they don't, something happened recently. So this happened actually last year. We had this major currency redesign, right? So the Nigerian economy is still predominantly cash-based. So a lot of transactions happen using cash. And it's been a very long time since the currency has been redesigned and reissued, granted. And then, for some reason, the central bank came up and said, we're redesigning the currency and you have 3 months to exchange all the old currency for the new one. And there's not going to be an extension, so if you're caught without exchanging and you have old notes afterwards, you will not be able to use this currency. Okay, so most people kind of complied. They went, and the only way you could do it was that you had to go to the bank, right? For a lot of people who actually don't have bank accounts, well, that was going to be a problem for them. But any which ways, you had a lot of people who would make a deposit of their old notes into their bank accounts. And when it now came to the point where they needed to get the new currency, that was where the real problem started to show up. First of all, the bank started to complain that they didn't have enough physical notes to be able to redeem the old ones. And then you had situations where, in cases where they had, they started putting certain limits on how much they could withdraw. Now, that created a situation where people started to really distrust the whole system, right? You just need to go online and search for, Naira redesign, and you see the videos of, people who were hopeless, who were like, this was the last money that they had, just being unable to be able to do any transaction whatsoever. And, it led to a lot of distress. And so, a lot of the young people that I started speaking with, they started having this resolve that I can't really trust this Naira system. And I had lots of people who started telling me how, they were either keeping their money in some kind of stable coin. A lot of people have concerns about the volatility of the price of Bitcoin, but some were actually also keeping Bitcoin. So I would say that it's happening with a lot of Nigerians, but I can tell you that there are lots of Nigerians who don't trust the Naira and who are beginning to, one by one, convert their savings, convert, the money, spare cash that they have either to Bitcoin or to some form of stable coin in order to be able to do so.
Thank you. Yeah, Tim, first of all, thank you very much for all you have been doing in Nigeria and Ghana for Bitcoin. Have you really, I understood you were the first trader at local Bitcoins in Nigeria?
I think so, yeah, maybe the first or second.
Okay, I think maybe people don't know what the dimension of that actually is, yeah. When I was in Zimbabwe last time, I spoke to a trader who told me he made in 2020 a trading volume of $300,000 to crypto. And then he said, but it's like 20% Bitcoin and 80% USDT. And it's just what you were also saying, because people want the property of a cryptocurrency, but they don't want the volatility. And then I also heard that in Nigeria, I heard that from Ray, from Paxful, that's the country where the highest percentage of Bitcoin users are. Is that correct? And why do you think that is?
So, I mean, amongst all my peers, I don't think there's anyone who hasn't heard about Bitcoin. And I would say maybe of all of them, 50% of them have, either bought Bitcoin at one point in time or the other. Now, in terms of percentage of the population, no, it's definitely not as high, but Nigeria is a very populous country and there are lots of people. So yes, it will appear that there are quite a number of Nigerians who use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much. I'm so sorry, folks, but we are out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off, but Tim will be here, and he's still here to hang out, answer your questions. Thank you so much for your talk, man.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.